The sun was scorching hot, and Francis felt the heat pressing on his bare back as he bent over a field of cassava. The small plot of land wasn't his. He was working for one of the wealthier farmers in Uhuala village. Sweat trickled down his face, mixing with the dust, but he couldn't afford to stop. The pay from this back-breaking labor was barely enough to buy food for one day. At night, Francis returned to his small mud house, where he had little more than a straw mat to sleep on. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of the more prosperous villagers celebrating life in their big houses. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but he had grown used to it. This had been his life for as long as he could remember, poor, forgotten, and with no prospects of a better future. Every day seemed like the last for Francis. He worked at construction sites, helped farmers till their land, and did odd jobs just to survive. His body was thin and weak, and his hands were raw from years of hard labor. He often thought about his days in secondary school when he had been hopeful and full of dreams. Back then, he believed that life would offer him more than endless suffering. One evening, while working on the construction site of a mansion being built in the village, a sleek black car rolled into the site, catching everyone's attention. Francis wiped the sweat from his face and watched as the driver stepped out. The man was tall, well-dressed, and clearly from the city. Something about him looked familiar, but Francis couldn't place it. The man's gaze swept over the workers, then suddenly, his eyes locked on Francis. "Francis," the man called out, his voice filled with surprise. Francis froze, wiping his hands on his torn shirt as the man approached him. It took a moment, but then recognition dawned on Francis. It was Ebuka, his old friend from secondary school. They had lost touch after school, and Francis had no idea what had become of Ebuka. The two embraced, though Francis felt a pang of embarrassment standing there in his filthy clothes while Ebuka looked as though he had just stepped out of a luxury car ad. "It's been so long," Ebuka said, his voice filled with nostalgia, but his eyes betrayed his concern as they scanned Francis's frail, unkempt form. "What's happened to you, Francis?" he asked quietly. Francis shrugged, trying to play it off as if it wasn't that bad. "I'm surviving," he said, his voice tight. But he couldn't meet Ebuka's eyes. The shame of his situation was unbearable. Here was his old friend, who had clearly become successful, and he was nothing more than a laborer, scraping by in a village that had long since forgotten him. Ebuka's face darkened with pity, and he gently placed a hand on Francis's shoulder. "We need to talk. Meet me tonight by the old iroko tree," he said before leaving the site. As Francis watched the car pull away, a sense of dread settled in his chest. What could he say to Ebuka? How could he explain how life had crushed him? That evening, Francis sat under the iroko tree, waiting for Ebuka. His heart was heavy with fear and curiosity. When Ebuka finally arrived, they sat in silence for a few moments. "Francis, I can't believe this is where life has taken you," Ebuka began, shaking his head in disbelief. He spoke of the opportunities he had seized, the business ventures that had made him rich, and the luxury he now enjoyed. Francis could only listen, feeling the weight of his failures press harder against him. "I want to help you, Francis. You were a good friend to me in school, and I can't leave you like this," Ebuka said, his voice filled with sincerity. Francis looked up, his heart leaping with hope. Could this be the moment his life finally changed? Ebuka leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "There are ways to get rich quickly, Francis. Ways that don't involve all this suffering." Francis blinked in confusion. Ebuka's eyes gleamed with something unspoken, something darker. "What do you mean?" Francis asked, intrigued but wary. "There's a network, a group of people who can change your life," Ebuka said. "I can introduce you to them, but you have to trust me completely. They can make you the wealthiest man in Uhuala in just a few weeks." The words hung in the air, thick with promise and mystery. Francis felt his pulse quicken. This was the opportunity he had been praying for. For the next few days, Francis wrestled with his decision. Could he really trust Ebuka? The thought of becoming rich was intoxicating, but something about the way Ebuka had spoken unsettled him. He had mentioned nothing of what this network actually did, only that they had the power to change fortunes. In the end, desperation won. Francis had suffered too much, and the prospect of wealth was too alluring to pass up. He met with Ebuka again and agreed to whatever it was his friend had in mind. Ebuka smiled and told him that everything would be arranged soon. "Just follow my lead, and your life will never be the same," he assured Francis. The days that followed were surreal for Francis. Ebuka arranged for new clothes, food, and even a temporary place to stay in the village while Francis's own mansion was being built. It all happened so quickly, Francis could hardly believe it. One moment he was a poor laborer, and the next, he was being treated like royalty. The villagers watched in awe as Francis's fortunes changed seemingly overnight. People who had once ignored him now flocked to his side, eager to bask in his new wealth. But amid the luxury, Francis couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the price for this sudden wealth had not yet been paid. As Francis's mansion neared completion, whispers began to circulate through the village. How had he come into such wealth so quickly? Was it really from some hidden business opportunity, or was something darker at play? The elders of the village began to discuss the strange events in hushed tones, but no one dared confront Francis directly. Meanwhile, Francis reveled in his new life. He had servants, fine clothes, and a lifestyle he had never imagined. The people in the village treated him with the utmost respect, even reverence. But still, in the quiet moments when he was alone, Francis couldn't ignore the growing unease in his chest. Something was coming, and he wasn't sure he was ready for it. One night, as Francis lay in his luxurious bed, he had a strange dream. In the dream, he was standing in front of a mirror, but the reflection staring back at him was not his own. The face in the mirror was dark, hollow-eyed, and grinning maliciously. The figure held out its hand, and Francis, feeling powerless, took it. He awoke with a start, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was dark, but the dream had left a lingering sense of dread. He tried to shake it off, convincing himself that it was nothing more than a nightmare. But deep down, he knew that something far more sinister was at work. The next day, Ebuka arrived at Francis's mansion with an unsettling smile. "How does it feel to be a man of wealth now?" he asked, his voice dripping with satisfaction. Francis hesitated before answering. "It's incredible," he replied, though his heart wasn't fully in the words. Something in Ebuka's demeanor made him uneasy. It was as if the man was reveling in some secret victory that Francis couldn't yet understand. As they sat in the plush living room, Ebuka leaned forward and lowered his voice. "There's one more thing you need to do, Francis. To secure everything you have, you must collect something very specific." Francis's pulse quickened. "What do I need to collect?" he asked, dreading the answer. Ebuka's smile widened. "Human hair. From as many people as possible." Francis recoiled in shock. "Human hair? Why?" he asked, his voice trembling. Ebuka's expression hardened. "Do not question it, Francis. Just do as I say. It's part of the arrangement, part of what keeps the wealth flowing." The explanation was vague, but Francis knew better than to push for more. He didn't want to know the deeper truth, and yet part of him suspected that something terrible lurked beneath Ebuka's instructions. For the next few days, Francis set about his task with a sense of dread gnawing at his soul. He visited local barbing salons under the guise of giving money to help them expand their businesses. In exchange, he requested the hair clippings from their customers, explaining that he needed it for some vague project. Most were too awed by his wealth to question him, and soon Francis found himself with a collection of hair. But the weight of guilt only grew heavier. As Francis continued gathering hair, strange things began to happen in the village. People who had recently had their hair cut at the salon started experiencing misfortunes. A young man lost his job, a woman's marriage fell apart overnight, and another villager had a severe accident while walking home from the market. Whispers spread like wildfire through the village, but no one could trace the source of the misfortunes. Francis watched in silence, a cold sweat trickling down his back as he realized the connection between the hair he had gathered and the disasters unfolding around him. He wanted to stop, to run from whatever dark path Ebuka had led him into, but it was too late. The mansion, the wealth, the power, it all held him captive. He had crossed the line, and now there was no turning back. One afternoon, Ebuka returned to Francis's mansion, his face lit with the same disturbing satisfaction. "How's the collection going?" he asked, his voice casual, as though they were discussing something as trivial as business deals. Francis swallowed hard, avoiding his friend's gaze. "It's done," he muttered. Ebuka grinned. "Good. The sacrifices have been made, and your wealth is now secure." The word, sacrifices, made Francis's blood run cold. He had suspected that the hair was part of some dark ritual, but hearing Ebuka confirm it made the horror all too real. Francis wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the fear of losing everything kept him silent. Ebuka patted him on the back and left without another word, leaving Francis alone in the grand, hollow mansion. Within weeks, the village of Uhuala had descended into chaos. More people fell victim to unexplained accidents, mysterious illnesses, and sudden strokes of misfortune. The village, once full of life and laughter, was now gripped by fear and sorrow. The elders called emergency meetings, desperate to understand what was happening to their people, but no one had any answers. Despite the growing calamity, Francis's wealth continued to soar. His mansion stood as a monument to his newfound success, yet the more his riches increased, the more the village seemed to fall apart. He tried to ignore the gnawing guilt that clawed at his insides, but the weight of his actions began to crush him. He could feel the darkness closing in, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could bear it. As the misfortunes continued to spread, the village elders grew suspicious of Francis. It was hard to ignore the timing of his sudden rise to wealth and the strange events that had plagued the village since. However, no one dared accuse him openly. Francis was too powerful now, and many feared the influence he wielded. Still, rumors swirled. Some said he had found hidden treasures, while others whispered of darker things, of deals made with malevolent forces. The elders began discreetly investigating Francis, visiting those who had suffered the most and gathering details about when their misfortunes had started. Though they had no proof, many fingers began pointing toward the mansion that towered over the village like a dark shadow. Francis barely slept anymore. Each night, he lay awake in his extravagant bed, staring at the ceiling and hearing the cries of the villagers echo in his mind. The voices of those who had suffered haunted his dreams, and when he did manage to drift off, he was plagued by nightmares of dark figures and cursed hair. He knew the wealth had come at a price, but he hadn't realized how steep that price would be. His hands felt stained with blood, though no one in the village had openly accused him of anything. He could feel the weight of their stares when he walked through the streets, the way their conversations died when he approached. His wealth had turned him into a stranger among his own people. One evening, unable to bear the guilt any longer, Francis decided to confide in Ebuka. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice trembling as they sat in the darkened living room of the mansion. "People are suffering because of what we've done. I didn't know it would be like this." Ebuka's face darkened. "It's too late to turn back now, Francis. The sacrifices have been made, and if you try to undo them, everything will be lost. Your wealth, your power, all of it." Francis's heart sank. He felt trapped, like a fly caught in a web. He had sold his soul for riches, and now there was no escape. Ebuka's cold eyes bore into him, and for the first time, Francis saw his old friend for what he truly was, a man consumed by greed and darkness. As Francis wrestled with his guilt, the situation in the village grew even worse. Families began fleeing Uhuala, seeking refuge in nearby villages where the strange misfortunes hadn't reached. The elders were at a loss, and some quietly suggested that dark forces were at play, though no one spoke openly about it.